Morning, everybody. I first want to acknowledge that I'm on the country of the Kulin Nation, and one of the clan areas of that, of course, is the Wurundjeri country. They're our neighbours. I'm a Yorta Yorta woman from the north of their country, and my country straddles both New South Wales and Victoria, introduce boundaries and borders. And hi, Doug. I also want to acknowledge our elders past and present, and particularly we've just had a great loss in our community who is in mourning. One of our great mothers, grandmothers, great-great-grandmothers has just passed away at the age of 94, which for my people is quite magnificent. And when I reflect on her life, she grew up in a settlement where her rights were diminished because she was Aboriginal, where she was bred to be a domestic for them very same cattle and sheep owners who took control of our land. So I want to acknowledge her. I want to acknowledge also my own mother, who was grew up with her, and she had a saying, and she said that the Mother Earth sets the rules, not us. So no matter what you think you're doing, no matter what you think you're trying to do to country, to world, if you are also a captive audience of that country, not the makers of it. Thank you for your talk. It means I don't have to do all that other background stuff. But ours is not a dreaming of a future. Ours was about survival. Surviving the onslaught of the invasion and trespass over our country. Where do you think our people hid and went when all this was happening? And there was a lecture that was done. I read, this was when our native title, and Ron Caston, who did our Yorta Yorta native case when we went to the High Court just before he passed away, brought up about the Laboya lectures and Professor Stanner, when he talked about Australia is living in a myth. And really it is about looking through a vision, a sphere of what you want to look through. And he likened it to looking out a window, because you would put the window where you want to see the best scenery, but you don't put a window where you want to see the worst misery. And that's what was happening to our people. I've got a broken arm, as you can see, so I haven't got all them beautiful pictures with a script in front of me. I've had to rely on this, and I'm not going to speak about, cultural knowledge in regards to, a lot of white fellas, they love, all that spiritual stuff and your dreaming stories and all that. I'm not into that. I'm straight into rights. So mine is about what is the emerging thing that is identified by my people over 20 years ago, 30 years ago, was the change that was happening with our weather, the change that was happening with our water, with our animals. We could see this was occurring. We knew that it was happening. It was happening to us in a number of ways. Socioeconomic disadvantages, remote locations, that makes us more vulnerable, more in sync with what was happening on our country. We weren't able to get our culture resources that supplemented our very poverty of living on the dole or whatever it is, on the margins of society. We were unable to get our fish, our tucker, because now we have 1% of our country as remnant bushlands. The rest is cleared. And that vulnerability increases as we try and live through what we see is emerging struggles on our country. Heat stress, weather events, vector-borne diseases, which is coming through into our communities, inadequate infrastructure for us to live in, services, particularly in the most remote communities. I live on Cumragunja. I regard that as remote because it is separated from, which is good in some ways, from those towns and regional centres. Sea level rise, storms, floods, they're all changing. Our mob said this is a change that we need to fight against. We need to make people aware of. The changes are, I remember very early in 18, when the steamboats were going down the Murray River. Our old people put in a petition or went to proclamation to the governor who was there, New South Wales governor, and said, "We got no more fish. You're cutting all the trees down. You're destroying the riverbanks with these steamers. We want a levy on every steamer that goes past so we can feed ourselves." It was even happening right back then. We fought everything that Indigenous peoples have or Aboriginal people have here in Australia has been fought for. You didn't lay it out. You didn't give it to us. We fought for it. And remember, the struggle in relation to our native title was not met because we even at those early stages, Yorta Yorta, I attended the prep-com for the Rio de Janeiro. I was with those Indigenous peoples from all around the world. There's over 60 million Indigenous peoples around the world. We fought for a place in there to give our voice about what we believed was happening with our country, with our worlds, with our reality. I sat there in March. This was in New York prior to the Rio de Janeiro. I didn't go to this particular one, but it was carrying on the message. We put a whole raft of different recommendations, as true whitefellas do, probably the ones that they understand the best and how they can use to broker or expand their worldview. Was the only one that actually got up was in regards to Agenda 21. You can read that. Agenda 21, Chapter 26, refers directly to the participation of the world's Indigenous peoples. It was basically about knowledge. So let's grab some knowledge. That will help us. We can get an idea of what happened in the past. Maybe we can get something from them Aboriginal peoples or peoples that are left in their countries. But some of these goals inherent in the objectives and activities implementation program, which basically all is about how supposedly we are supposed to be a part of the reclamation, getting back to country, our rights, having some say in what's going on, not just being a part of that window, and when you actually look maybe around the corner you might see us. We'd also fought very hard for the ILO Indigenous Tribal Peoples Convention in number 169, which talks about, for the very first time, the collective nature of tribal groups, of self-determination, of the ability for us not to be single citizens of a state such as Australia, but actually be recognised as a collective groupings of peoples with rights and knowledge and privilege that should be accounted for directly in country. Then, of course, a part of that also, I attended a few of the, not all of them, the with the working group, the Indigenous working group at that time, leading up to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Why do we need to do that? As we know, Australia is committed to these goals. That's why you as scientists or practitioners need to recognise what has gone on and what your overarching principles are. They're as little as they are for Indigenous peoples, but they need to be recognised. So coming into it, we've designed, I went to Ramsar, international Ramsar conventions, because of course the area of country that most important to us, it's not like it's the only part, all of our country is important, and all the waterways that lead into the Broken, the Murray, the Dungala, the Campaspe, all those, the Goulburn, all that those lead into our country, is one of our most sacred areas, is now called the Barmah National Park and the Murray Valley National Parks. We had a say in making them national parks only because we wanted to get rid of logging and cattle grazing and the last vestiges of, colonisation that was going on in there. We've got the problem with the horses now. Of course, they're traditional horses now. But so we went about looking at a project that works with. We were working with scientists from Monash University at that stage, 2011 and 14, develop a testing and protocols and methodology of collection and protection of our Yorta Yorta knowledge, knowing that there was a specific process that should be entailed with that. Building our own framework to integrate both our knowledge and more conventional data around climate, hydrology, biodiversity of our country. Exploration of views and broader community in the region regarding joint management of the region, because we know at this present time, it's not maybe the future, but this present time, we are mere participants in a broader Australian context. But we are not mere participants in Australia. I have my own independent identity, my own nation, my own set of laws, my own peoples. And we know outside of Australia, because you've put Australia on top of us. Identification of broader lessons for improving the adaptation of First Nations changing environment, which has been changing all the time. We've been a part of that change. But the devastation that we've experienced in the last 150 or more years in our country has been absolute. And other nation peoples through a national workshop which we held in Echuca in 2012. I wasn't at that. I was actually working at Amnesty International as a national manager, trying to fight that bloody intervention and everything that was going on up in Northern Territory, where they told lies, of course. The project raised Yorta Yorta people's awareness of knowledge through our elders, energised our Yorta Yorta youth to revive interest in their history, culture, our country. Overall, the project also in piloting a GIS database to meld people's knowledge and conventional Western knowledge into cultural maps for each of from our own people's knowledge into maps that we could use as part of the changing environment and as part of overlay. So that when we have Vic Roads come to us, when we have any of the developers coming to us, we can say this is our baseline of how we see our country. You put your overlay on there and we'll tell you where we think things should be. Our Yorta Yorta people look after our waka, our land, our walla, our water, and our mulana, our spirit. Being proactive about taking action. Defining how academics and those involved in both government and civil society on natural resource management to work with our First Nations. First people can take a proactive approach and be involved, not from involvement, but from rights that we've been fighting for a long time. Inherent rights because this is our country. best practice guidance for knowledge transfer and protocols within Australia and internationally are there. They need to be at the very beginning of any of your scientific, any of your works, anything that you want to do. In addition, we tell our communities, read the fine print on external contracts and be unafraid to negotiate better terms and conditions. Developing connections with First Nation communities, sharing what we have. We aren't isolated islands. We have always the Kulin Nations and us, the Wurundjeri, the Nurrungeri, along that river, from the mountains to the sea. Our river, our survival, the water was connected. From the mountain to the sea, to the sea to the mountain, back again. It's all a part of the cycle of life. Initiating and undertaking research projects and community development programs that address our needs. And educating the community, particularly policymakers and academics, about the appropriate ways to engage with First Nations on lands, both within the Australian Commonwealth laws and our own First Nation laws. So I've just, out of the last 3 days, have been meeting with traditional owners from all over Australia. At the Dania Centre in the Barmah Forest, but that's our country, our land, the Moira lands, Merolithica lands. And we've been talking about what we want as a people. We did this when we brought them in, collaboration with the CSIRO, the Kimberley Land Council and SEED, which is an Indigenous Youth Climate Network. Over 80 peoples representing many First Nations and traditional owners, Aboriginal traditional owners or custodians, because a lot of our mob have had to move around and unfortunately, through not being able to live on their own countries for whatever reason, have moved to other places that have been wiped out of our mob, genocided. We met to speak on our concerns on climate change, spelling mistake, set our priorities for collaboration on 4 projects across different ecosystems within Australia. Ecosystems, whatever you say. A strong message coming from the participants at not only that workshop but previous workshops that we had in 2012 was that taking ownership of and authority for determining what is right for our people through the United Nations Rights Convention, Human Rights Convention, and more rights more specific to Indigenous peoples of the world, such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A minimum standard, because the states had to have their say, didn't they? Australia signed off 4 years later with America, New Zealand and Canada, of course, the CANS Alliance, the little alliance there. They urged First Nation peoples to be proactive, assert approach to ensure that our communities are ready to respond to climate change and future changes to our country, not to be passive in the face of lack of external support and imposition of inappropriate solutions. Talking about landscapes, that sounds like a British word to me. It's a British coloniser's concept of land. Somehow how people can manoeuvre and shape the land. The land shapes the people. You cannot at all be a part of this landscape, your landscape, my country, my spirit, my inheritance, where I sprung from, my creation. Without understanding, you can't impose. This Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is very important because it's a baseline. It not only looks at the Human Rights Charter for all peoples, it puts it in a collective mode that is specific for Indigenous peoples. Of particular interest, I think, for many of you as practitioners, whatever fields you come from and doing, is Article 31, 32 and 33. They talk about traditional lands and waters and knowledge, but for some reasoning, and this is why it was good, scientists say new knowledge. Any new knowledge that is created, and we just had this big debate with these scientists that were at this conference, new knowledge somehow is their knowledge. We've been dealing with new knowledge for over 200 years. And any knowledge that we've got now is a part of the adaptation and the survival within our country. So that new knowledge, old knowledge, future knowledge belongs to us in collaboration about how we want to share it. I think you can go through that declaration yourself. This is a statement that was taken from the people that I've just left. And and I'm not putting it on the screen, you can't own it, see? Statement for traditional owners, meeting to discuss climate change. Now we might talk about biodiversity, we might talk about, and what is absolute extreme to our mob is water, the theft of water, the change in the water regime patterns, and the absolute situation that we're going to face if farmers continue to keep planting cotton and rice and blooming grapevines, for God's sake. How much wine can you drink? It's a statement from traditional owners meeting to discuss climate change on Yorta Yorta lands. As custodians, we're the custodians. First Nations people, we have always understood and adapted to change on our country. Through our cultural knowledge and practices, we are intimately connected to our mother, the ongoing changes she faces. Our culture endures and unites us all in its preservation and respect for others. It's all our responsibility to share, respect and practice cultural continuity. As custodians and First Nations people, we have always understood and adapted with country. Through our cultural practices, we interpreted change. We have come together in this place and this time because of our love for our country and the looming threat that climate change represents to our people, our culture and our law, LORE. Changing climate will mean the removal from country for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Another cultural cleansing. This will mean the end of 80,000, I would say from since Dreamtime, years of continuous knowledge and cultural practice. In this country, we will be the adversely affected by climate change, and yet we are given the least amount of input into the conversation to mitigate and adapt. We condemn this injustice. Our people survived the last major climate event. Our knowledge is integral to humanity's survival of the next one. We only need to be listened to. It is our time to lead the conversation. We call on the Australian Government to participate with us, to stop and look and listen. Stop destroying and desecrating our country. Look to the future where the terrible path we are on leads to. There is no stopping of coal mines, of fracking, all those things in our countries, of the pillage of the artesian basins and the underground water of aquifers, all those things that are sacred and very important to our mobs. Look to the future and where the terrible path we are on leads to. Listen to our knowledge and culture. Otherwise, we're facing cataclysmic consequences. This all means the immediate cessation of legislative and contractual genocide they have been committing for centuries, and to observe and respect the sovereignty of First Peoples culture. In this, we call on the Australian governments and all of you, a part of Australia, to formally and permanently subscribe to Articles 31 to 39 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to treat us with dignity and respect that these minimum principles outline. We also call on the Australian Government to resource us adequately so we can continue to observe and teach the cultural processes that are going to help meet this enormous challenge. Agenda 21 goes through a whole process. Chapter 26 goes through a whole process about how Indigenous peoples of the world should be appropriately resourced and entered into dialogue in relation to every nation, every state in the world. So it is imperative that not only state governments but the Commonwealth put into practice all those things that are described in that. We are humble before our ancestors and our elders and ask that the Australian Government and its people humble themselves as well. It is only united that we can meet this threat, and only divided we will all fall. Our people you can't commodify and put it all up in different departments. Anthropology there, biodiversity here, water there, it's whole. It's one life force, one. And you all live on that life force, and we all have to survive within that life force. We are heading for peril. You just are. I was in Palau. I spoke to all them people in the Pacific Island. They are under immediate threat. Who cares? Australian government has said to them, they've asked, can we? And our people, my people, have said, yes, come. They are trying to set up places where they can move their whole communities. What does the Australian government say? No, we won't deal with that. They're not going to enter into that negotiation. Australia, the main contributor to those rising as a Western world, they can't isolate themselves and say that part of the Western civilisation hasn't been a part of that whole detriment. But no, we can't even. You can't even, your mob can't even allow them a space on this country so that when they can't even pull up yams. This is what they're going through right this very part, and it's our Indigenous peoples of the world that is at the coalface of all this. I hate to use that word coalface because we hate coal. When my old people put in the native title, it wasn't for wealth, it wasn't for anything, it was to try and give voice to our mob so that they can tell the yarns and the stories. If you want to know all the yarns and stories, you go to that transcript where at the end of it they said Yorta Yorta people's native title is gone with the tide of history. You know what? That us having to live with the change, we cannot dance and sing like our ancestors from 1788 because it's not the same world. Thank you.